Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Roundtable. Today, I'm here with my longtime friend, Mr. Chris Jenkins, with the National Loan Exchange, better known as NLEX. How you doing today, Chris?
Doing well. Appreciate you having me. Good to catch up.
You as well. I know. I'm glad that we actually got to recording today. It's been too long since we've had a chance to connect, so I know it turned into a little bit of chatter, but I think that helps us plan for a good discussion here. But for anybody who is not as lucky as I am to have been your friend for the last couple of decades, could you tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
Sure. So I started with National Loan Exchange in 2004. Was fortunate enough to fulfill my lifelong dream of becoming a debt broker, which I think every young boy has. And more truthfully, my good friend Tom Ludwig, who is our general counsel and executive vice president, in around 2004, decided to pursue his goal of becoming an attorney and join law school. Tom had recently graduated and was working for his father, Dave Ludwig, our president and founder. And at that time, he said, "Hey, we've always talked about you potentially coming on. My dad knows you, likes you. Why don't you come in and interview with everyone else and see if it works out?" And it just sort of fell into my lap, as fortune often will, and joined in 2004 and started working on the buyer side of things. We were going through quite a bit of changes internally at that time, made a few moves. That position and role kind of stayed and grew through the early till around 2012, 2013. At that point, I had kind of left and done a few things on my own and had a classic sort of grass is greener situation. And after a few years away, rejoined. Started again running our buyer division. We had hired some folks in, and things were quite a bit different with our organization at that time, but kind of kept growing out that role, continuing on and expanding my relationships with buyers that I'd been cultivating throughout the years. Eventually moved on through a few different promotions from there. I'm currently our senior vice president of operations and strategic integration, which means I kind of oversee our ops and just general day-to-day sale operations and make sure that our various divisions are all working together and delivering on our kind of our standard of work and that we pride ourselves on. So that's where I'm at now. I've got a great team. I feel very fortunate every day to be able to work with people that I both respect and enjoy personally. A lot of people I know tend to say like this company's family, and that's kind of an easy typical answer. I generally feel that way. We've got a great team. I respect everyone I work with. I'm never the smartest guy in the room, which is always great. When you're in a public facing organization and everyone's got to be sharp and on top of their game. We're I think a 17-person organization, 16 or 17. I should know that. But so we're small and nimble, and have been fortunate enough to watch our business continue to grow year over year. This has been an exciting journey for me. This is the breadth of my professional experience. I've been doing this, I went from managing a bar and a pizza place to this. So this is all I've done. I owe everything I have personally to this industry and this organization, and I take it very seriously, very personally. I'm very proud to be a part of this industry, and it's wonderful to be a part of an organization that I think contributes so much positively to it. And I get to talk.
Let's talk a little bit about the organization itself as well, right? Because National Loan Exchange is an organization that has been, I would say its history and the history of the industry are very intertwined. So talk to me a little bit about National Loan Exchange and what it is that you guys do there.
Sure. So National Loan Exchange was founded in 1993 formally. We had our roots in liquidating assets for the RTC, which is the Resolution Trust Corporation.
Mhm.
For those that don't know, that was essentially founded during the savings and loan crisis in the first Bush administration. So there were a series of failures throughout the country. RTC was formed to liquidate those, kind of save a lot of people's bacon, and kind of get the nation's banking system back on track. So again, we had our roots in what started as largely an REO liquidation. So we were selling a lot of gas stations and small businesses and things like that. Eventually, once that was complete, we were still looking at some smaller local institutions that had some what they didn't view as assets, but we kind of took a second look and said, well, you've got these judgments, charge-offs, and deficiencies on your books. I want to say it was Boatman's Bank out of St. Louis who spoke with Dave, our founder, and said, hey, I've got these things, can you sell this stuff for me? And he said, oh, sure, of course. Came back to the office and looked at the team and said, hey, what do we do? And from there we became a debt broker. So that grew pretty quickly. He went from liquidating some sales from some smaller local banks and some regional entities to running some of the first major sales for most, if not all, of the major financial institutions in the country. I think Amex is the exception, but pretty much all your kind of top 10 banks that anyone would be familiar with. If we didn't run their first sale, we probably ran their second sale after the first one didn't go so well. We introduced a lot of institutions to the market throughout the years. We kind of pride ourselves on bringing a lot of people to the market for the first time. We have a lot of long-time clients who we support. Going from memory here, I think our current longest standing client has been with us for 12 years, running monthly sales that entire time. So, we have grown with the marketplace and have been around for a lot of the ups and downs, which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today, is really getting into the predictions of kind of what's happening, because I think as an industry, and I mean, for those of you that frequently watch my podcast, you hear me talking about the balance of collectability and volume. And I feel like I've probably said it 5 times today alone, but the collectability and volume. And so last month we saw multiple articles start to come out talking about the auto loan deficiencies and how that wave has started to crest, right? And I think, as we've talked about it, that's just an indicator of the rest of the marketplace, because it's been my experience that the car is one of the last things that somebody wants to let go of, right?
Absolutely.
In terms of making payments, because that car is generally how they're getting to work. Although in a work from home economy, we may be seeing some additional shifts, which puts a little bit more uncertainty into the marketplace. But, as you're starting to, with what you're seeing in the marketplace now, and kind of looking to predict what we might see going into 2024, anything on the horizon that the industry should be keeping an eye on?
Well, that's a great question. And, I don't think there's a specific target or event that you can necessarily say, hey, 3 months from now, watch for X, because it's coming. Because quite frankly, since early 2020, everyone's sort of been predicting what the next big implosion or explosion, depending on
next big
you ask.
Point in time.
You got it. And I think if anyone would have relied on their predictions from April of 2020 as to what was going to happen, we'd all be out of a job. So, it's always kind of difficult to gaze into the crystal ball, but I think kind of on the whole, what the industry needs to sort of focus on and I guess find a point of intersection with it is finding that where the increases in volume and sort of the stabilization or normalization, depending on who you ask, of collections sort of meet. Because that's been the biggest difference in my experience with this current cycle we're in. There's been events throughout, my 20-ish years in the space. There's been a macroeconomic event that triggered some sort of massive shift in the industry, and whether it's the '08 crash or bankruptcy reform or a number of other things along the way. it's what started as a supply constraint and then shifted into a supply explosion. Um, we haven't seen a lot of the typical behavior in some of the previous, we'll say down cycles. You could make an argument that 2021 and 22 were an upcycle because recoveries were great. There wasn't much in the way of supply, but people were on the whole collecting with the accounts that they had, and in most cases doing very well. And I think that was fairly universal. And we have the luxury of kind of having deep relationships with some of the larger buyers and agencies and some of the smaller groups as well. And whether it's law firms or legal networks, on the whole, collections were up, and there's a lot of theories, and we can have a whole episode, I'm sure, just determining what caused that and kind of what the root cause of people paying their bills and answering the phone and trying to get current were. Good luck figuring that out. And at this point, I think we're over that hump. So
it was a perfect storm, and it's now in the past.
You got it. I think you could argue that we spent a couple of years kind of in the eye of the hurricane. Everything looked great, and then it sort of.
But there was a hurricane going around us.
You got it. We're still in the hurricane. I'm just not sure everyone's in the smooth waters anymore. Mm-hmm. So I think sort of rebalancing, and when supply started to return, I had a lot of conversations with folks who were approaching it and just saying, hey, we're taking 2020 to current day off our books. We're removing that from our model. We're no longer looking at pricing from that time. We're no longer looking at recoveries from that time. We're even reassessing kind of how we look at different asset classes. That time never happened. Let's move on. And, I think it worked initially when there was some uncertainty as kind of how long the volumes were going to last or increase or whatever that cycle was going to look like. And the reality of it was they kept going up, and they're continuing to go up. And I'm not seeing any signs of them going down. Now, we were not seeing quite the drastic increase in volumes, but across asset classes, we're still seeing some gradual creep in volumes. Doesn't matter who the seller is, doesn't matter what the product is, everything's up. So anything we've seen in the past, it's bigger now, period. I don't think there's anyone who would really debate that point. Volumes are up, and they're going to continue to grow. They've definitely stabilized, and we're seeing a much more sort of gradual growth versus just over, but it's still there. And until that kind of levels out and folks can either forecast out or truly model out what volumes are going to look like this time next year, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think the focus now is sort of getting recoveries back on track, because that's another trend that is sustained. I want to say probably October or so, 2022, we really started to hear about the fallout, and it's just continued to decrease. And whether it's traditional collections or legal, I haven't heard much of a rebound. And again, that's not unique to any particular asset class. And the numbers are just down. Things have slowed down. Big, small, legal, phone, letter.
So let me ask you this: as we go into 2024, do you think that we'll still find the same balance or correlation between the price and the volume? Because as those volumes are increasing, the collectability of those accounts can't remain the same, right? If you're increasing this volume, the quality of that volume must change at least some correlated rate. So do you think that we're going to continue? I mean, we saw it in 2008, we saw it in 2010, we've seen it pretty much every time we've had an economic cycle. It has remained. Is there anything that would make you believe that does not remain the same?
Well, it's been a little different this time as well, with sort of the way the
a lot of uncertainty.
Well, sure, absolutely. We saw kind of an instant drop, and it wasn't quite as sudden as at least I had expected. And I take a lot of flack internally about being the glass half empty guy, but I tend to be on the front lines of hearing the bad news. Whether it just be a discussion about price or performance of a previous product, I'm hearing the stories as they're happening, kind of putting out fires along the way with problems with portfolios we sold, and kind of helping buyers through different situations with transactions we've been involved with. So I'm hearing it every day. Guys on our side whose conversations are largely just kind of focus on the seller side, it's a little different.
Mhm.
Sellers know what's going on. They're seeing the same things on the front end and on their back end as well. I think everyone's on the same page as far as performance goes, and everyone's seeing it again in every asset class, and it really has slowed down. So to answer your question in as long-winded way as possible, I think that's the real correction that's occurring right now, is that we're seeing pricing that's much more performance-based versus market-driven.
Mhm.
You know,
Do you
obviously,
think that there's a part of that that's based on the availability of funding? Like, so as we look at the last like 2 years, right? Like, and if you look at specialty finance and all of that, a lot of this is margin based lending, right? Even if you've got private money coming from the bank, or you got private money coming from venture capital firms or whatever, right? Like, so much of this is on the float, and with that availability of capital, I feel like that supply and demand curve is a little more out of balance than in the last 20 years, because since the timeline that you're talking about, and we've been around roughly the same amount of time, right? Like I entered in '06, but between '06 and now, interest rates have never really changed,
no.
right? I mean, they went down to as low as they could possibly go, right? When they were literally giving away cars at 0% for
Yeah.
72 months to where we are now, right? And so you think that cost of capital is starting to be a driving factor in the supply and demand curve?
Absolutely. And I think that's another anomaly with this latest cycle that we didn't see prior. And through any time there was any sort of a big disruption, and whether it's prices up or down, either way, when there was a large disruption, the first thing to go typically was the capital. And, immediately you get the calls either directly from the lender or from the buyer saying, hey, my capital's got scared feet, or we were right in the middle of a refi or a recapitalization and they're getting out of the space. We didn't see that throughout 2020. And frankly, I would argue that capital flowed into the space.
Freely flowed into the space between 2018 and 2021.
So a lot of the volatility I think we're experiencing right now is sort of the repercussions of that. And to your point, the sort of performance-based metrics that a lot of those loans were written on. And I think a lot of the uncertainty right now in our space is sort of what's going to become of those purchases that were all financed throughout that weird time, to where none of their criteria that was very true and relevant at that time applies now.
Applies anymore.
Yeah. Whether it's market price, which certainly weighs in, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the reality. If you're looking at things from the finance end and something was 22 cents a year ago and it's 9 cents now, you've got an issue regardless of performance. You're not going to bridge that gap by having folks come in on Saturday and hit the phones, right? That's a challenging gap. And so that in itself is a problem. And then you've got your drastic change in performance, which again affects all asset classes and every buyer. There is no mousetrap that's going to kind of catch up with that, or better mousetrap. That's a very challenging situation for buyers and sellers and lenders alike. And so, we're part of the correction that we're seeing definitely is capital driven. You're also in, I think, a buyer's market for the first time in some time based purely on supply. Throughout that weird sort of time, you saw a lot of R&D spends, and then there were people that
you've got the supply and you've got the capitalization, right? So like when you start tying these two things together, you almost expect a tide change.
Absolutely. And when you can go back and just buy an unlimited supply of your specialty asset, or if you can stay in your wheelhouse at the lowest price you've seen in, probably 15 years at this point, and there's an unlimited supply, that's going to change the market dynamic as a whole, because guys that were buying auto deficiencies or student loans or medical, which are 3 asset classes we could have an episode about in themselves
on their own.
Yeah. Now they're like, I'm out of that space. I'm buying credit cards or consumer loans, and I'll buy them as long as I can get cash. But that in itself is great. It is a challenging situation for buyers, because if you're looking at it and saying, well, this paper was 17 cents last year and it's going for 9.5 now. Wow, what a great deal. I think there's a lot of folks who are stepping back and saying, do we know if 9.5 is right? Or,
Well, I think do you know if 9.5 is right? And just because someone overbought at 17 doesn't make it worth 17. It means it was worth 17 to that person at that time.
you got
And I
it.
think the problem with pricing is it gets inked every time we write it down.
Agree.
Right? We never write the pricing of a deal in pencil. It's always in ink, and we can't. So as you look at these correlations and changes over time, you're kind of stuck with what happened at each point in time. And I know as we looked at the 2008 crash, right? Prices were skyrocketing in 6, 7, and going into 8, and then on the tail end to 8 with prices just coming to the floor. But again, I think availability of capital, not because of interest rate or the cost of capital, just the total availability of people wanting to invest in a less sophisticated investment vehicle.
Right.
And I think that took time for us to demonstrate that this is a more complex and a more sophisticated investment vehicle for VCs and other institutional money. And I think that's where you've seen some big players sprout from in the space.
Agree. And I do think that kind of the more sort of controlled correction that we've seen this time around, meaning that you're not going from 22 to 9 overnight, which did happen in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, quite suddenly, I think speaks volumes to sort of the maturation of the market as a whole. And our industry has, across the board in every metric, becomes quite a bit more sophisticated over these last 20 years. And I would say there's just been substantial growth over the last 5 to 10. And that, a lot of credit to the RMAI and, a lot of vendors and other organizations within the space like yourself who have really focused on education and bringing participants into the sort of new era of our industry. And, there's been a ton of professional growth across the board. There's a ton more certifications for everyone to get out and get ahead of things. The industry's lobbying efforts have become, a sophisticated, really force to be reckoned with. 12 years ago, lobbying efforts were essentially, 3 companies that everyone knows.
Handshakes and hugs.
Yeah, you got it. Going to Capitol Hill and shaking hands with guys they knew, a couple different trade organizations occasionally rubbing elbows and making suggestions. We're seeing real traction from the trade organizations now. We're seeing real involvement from real debt buyers who have real skin in the game, which wasn't the case before. People tended to kind of stay arm's length and let the trade associations. Now you've got, you've been lobbying. I've seen you shaking hands on Capitol Hill. A lot of folks that were in your previous role with the board are there every day. I have trouble getting a hold of buyers because they're speaking
because they're in Washington,
which is great.
But look, it's a believable statement with the amount of energy and effort that goes into building those relationships over time and creating a positive environment, and honestly getting out and educating before there's a problem. Because I think the old school methodology for managing kind of lobbying efforts was to just, when something's hot, let's go deal with it. And now it's become about education and learning. And I feel like that's been a push across the space, right? I was having a conversation internally the other day where somebody had made the statement of, look at everything that the CFPB has done, for the industry. And I kind of countered with it. And I said, although I appreciate some of the things that have been accomplished, I would argue that RMAI certification has done more to remove bad actors from this industry than a government agency could do in the next 500 years. And we did it ourselves because we already knew who the bad players were and we just stopped doing business with them, right? So I feel like the industry itself kind of had this awakening and kind of did a lot of this heavy lifting on its own, and it was expensive and it was a heavy lift, and it took a lot of people, right? Some that are still around the space, some that are not, but it really took a significant amount of effort over 20 years to bring us to where we're at today.
Agree. And I think something that has become much more prominent than in years past, our industry has a good story to tell. We are an important part of the economic cycle and a vital part of the credit cycle or credit-based economy in this country. And we are not the bad guys that are perpetuating some cycle of poverty. And, we are helping people who do make responsible decisions financially continue to have access to options. And even those who have had struggles financially, we give them a path to recovery, and we can help people get back on track. It's good for the banks. It's good for consumers. It's good for the general consumer economy in this country because you can go out and get a loan for anything now. As you well know, there is very few restrictions on a credit option when you go to purchase a good or a service. And part of the reason that is possible is that there is some back end recovery that our industry provides. Outside of the direct economic injection that all the great jobs that our space provides, and all the direct local and regional financial support that our industry provides, we
balance interest rates.
You got it.
Right. That's everything that I don't feel like this message has ever really hit home more than in the last 12 months when people are seeing interest rates rise, and it becomes a function of risk versus reward probabilities. And so the more risk that I have to take on in lending money, the more interest I have to charge on those loans for those that are not. And you can look at the government programs where those of us with over a 620 credit score are now subsidizing with an additional fee on new mortgages that go back. But again, that's a different story for a different timeline, Chris. Chris, let me tell you, I really appreciate you coming on and having this chat with me today. It's always interesting to get your insights as someone who really does have their finger on the pulse of what's going on around the space. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights with myself and the audience.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope we can do this again. Really appreciate everything you do for our industry, Adam. I don't think you get enough credit. So keep spreading the good word and educating our space, and you and I can get on next time and just talk about how much we've grown as an industry. And, I'll give you some.
I look forward to the continuation of this discussion because I think there's a lot of things that you guys are doing as an organization and as individuals that are essential to how the debt sales marketplace moves forward, and ultimately that drives a lot of what happens across all of receivables management. And I think you guys have a lot of insight to share. So I look forward to helping you tell that story in the future. For those of you that are watching, if you have additional questions for Chris or myself, you can leave those in the comments below here on LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll be responding to those. Or if you have additional topics you'd like to see us discuss, you can leave those in the comments on LinkedIn and YouTube as well. And hopefully I'll get Chris to come back here at least one more time to help me continue to create great content for a great industry. But until next time, Chris, again, I really appreciate you coming on today. Your insights are impactful.
Well, thank you, sir. Anytime.
And for those of you watching today, we really appreciate your time as well. And we'll talk to you all again soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.